This is the Kratom Science Journal Club with Dr. Jonathan Cachat, neuroscientist and expert in psychopharmacology. In each episode, we discuss an article in a peer-reviewed journal. I'm your host, Brian Gallagher, blog and social media writer for KratomScience.com, your source for all things Kratom. The name of the study is Non-Prescribed Buprenorphine Use Mediates the Relationship Between Heroin Use and Kratom Use Among a Sample of Polysubstance Users. These were all people in residential recovery programs in Kentucky. The stated purpose of the study is, quote, to further examine survey data pertaining to lifetime and past year substance use reported by a sample of polysubstance users enrolled in residential peer-led recovery programs in Kentucky in order to determine concomitants of past year Kratom use and to better understand drug preferences of past year Kratom users. So the whole context of this is actually I think like 88% of these people had been incarcerated in the previous 7 years before this the data was taken. 85% were referred by the Kentucky Department of Corrections. This is Appalachia, which I think most people who listen to this know about the opioid overdose epidemic or whatever you want to call it, that is the focus is kind of centered in Appalachia, where there was a lot of prescriptions and there's a lot of poverty. In this study, it's 57% male, mostly white, most of them had graduated high school at least, and a few of them have a quarter have like an associate's or vocational degree, and like 14% have at least a bachelor's degree.
Well, so before we get a little too deep into the methodology design and the sample population, I just wanted to know two things. I'm not sure if we mentioned it, but this paper was published in 2019, and it's from and actually a really surprisingly interdisciplinary team of researchers from University of Kentucky or University of Louisville. But when I say interdisciplinary, I mean they have researchers from the School of Social Work, the Center for Drug and Alcohol Research, the Sociology Department, the Behavioral Science Department, the Medicinal Chemistry Department, as well as the School of Law. So given that this is a survey-based, like sort of socio-demographic analysis that is with controlled substances, I think it's really encouraging and actually provides a lot of support to their design of the study and then the subsequent analysis by having such a wide range of different researchers on this paper.
Yeah, and I didn't notice the School of Law one. Dr. Kirsten Smith, I think she originally collected the data. I think she's originally from Kentucky. I'm going to be interviewing her next week. She's currently at NIDA. And then Oliver Grumman, we had on the podcast before. He's at University of Florida, and he's done some of the larger Kratom surveys. But that's interesting that you say about the law, because a lot of these people were, 85% were referred to the researcher, I think Dr. Smith, by the Department of Corrections in Kentucky. They were all in a rehab program.
Right. Yeah. So they were essentially, the investigators were trying to figure out if people who are opiate dependent will intake kratom use more often and use more kratom more often than those that don't have a history of opiate dependence, and if there's a difference between heroin and street drugs versus prescription pharmaceuticals, and how that relates to Suboxone use. But yeah, like you mentioned, the total number of recruits that they had was around 500 plus. I think they had around 475-ish total surveys that were valid. 85% were referred by the Department of Corrections. They were from 5 recovery centers across the state. They had represented like large metropolis areas, smaller metropolis areas, rural locations, and that these recruits who participated in the survey weren't provided any compensation, but it would not affect their enrollment in the treatment program that they were mandated into or their actual sentence for whatever they got sent to jail for first as well. Yeah. So, and then just to highlight too a little the socio-demographic that you sort of went over. On average, the individual was 30 years old, 35 years old, 85% white, 50% single versus married, and then had at least a high school or equivalent diploma and worked full time. That's how they describe the sort of summary person of the 475.
Yeah, and I think a big focus of this is what they call diverted buprenorphine. Now, for people who don't know, I'm sure most of the people who listen know about this already, but like buprenorphine, like Subutex, or that's just buprenorphine, and Suboxone is with naloxone, is what's in the past few years being prescribed for withdrawal and addiction and
opiate disorder, yeah. So
opiate use disorder, yeah. But what they talk about in the title and throughout the paper is non-prescribed buprenorphine, or they also call it diverted buprenorphine, which is buying prescription pills on quote-unquote the street. Like, somebody will get them from a doctor, then resell them on to other people. Like, they don't actually need them, but they know they can sell them for more than they're getting for them at the pharmacy. So
right, yeah. So people who sought out Suboxone through a street source versus from a professional medical treatment facility. But I thought it was interesting too, in the introduction, they right off the bat talk about iatrogenic opiate dependence and this desire to separate individuals who developed opiate use disorder from harder street drugs or non-prescribed uses versus those who, over a long period of time, while treating a legitimate pain complaint or pain issue, have just been on prescription opiates for a very long time. That's called iatrogenic opiate dependence. And it's an interesting discussion I think they lay out, saying that there is different factors involved in becoming dependent on opiates, whether or not you're being subscribed them or you're getting them from the street. And so they're sort of trying to tease that apart a little bit.
They even quoted that Grundmann's survey found that of respondents who reported having used Kratom to mitigate withdrawal symptoms of current or previous drug dependency, most reported that withdrawal symptoms stemmed from iatrogenic opioid dependence, but a subset stem from illicit drug dependency. A lot of these people in here were legitimately prescribed opioids. A certain percentage became dependent on them.
And it's, I think, worthwhile pointing out that prior to the release of Oxycontin, the long-term, regular use of opiates for treatment of chronic pain wasn't necessarily popular or widespread. I mean, you basically had to have cancer or some other very significant and obvious neurological damage, or an indication that was causing you pain, but you generally wouldn't be put on the opiate prescriptions for an extended period of time until Oxycontin was developed and then explicitly marketed as a safe long-term treatment for chronic pain conditions. And I think we all know where that ended up.
Yeah, and I just I'm connected to the chronic pain people now that can't get any prescription at all because they're kind of overcorrecting for it now. And I had on Dr. Klein would tell you that it's still 1% that get addicted, but they were just prescribing them to everybody. That's why the 1% becomes from a bigger sample size because of the overprescription. I think a lot of these people who were focusing on this study, but there's a possibility that some had just been busted with drugs and they're probably in this treatment program as kind of a court order. Anyway, but the sample size are people who definitely had used drugs, some kind of drug in the past year, which is here we're talking about heroin, prescription opioids, sedatives, marijuana, cocaine, amphetamines, and non-prescribed buprenorphine and kratom.
I think it's just worthwhile to do a refresher on the difference between addiction and dependency too.
Yeah.
Because I think by very definition, if someone's on, let's say, Vicodin or Percocet for 5 years every day, they are by definition dependent on that. Mm-hmm. But being dependent on the medication doesn't necessarily mean that you're addicted. Everybody has sort of a different threshold of what classifies or counts as addiction versus dependence. The way I've heard it most recently described is that addiction has consequences. So your social life, your personal life, your work life is being affected negatively. There are consequences due to the use versus dependence in that, like, you're psychologically or physically used to or have developed a tolerance and used to taking those on a daily basis. And I say that in the context of opiate use disorder doesn't necessarily mean that you're addicted. It could also mean that you're dependent. And so in this case, and I think broader throughout this whole article, they're talking about whether or not individuals who are dependent or have opiate use disorder, they could have been addicted and brought into jail and arrested on some illicit charges. But there are also plenty of people out there who were taking the prescriptions for a long, long time and want to stop or either wean themselves off. And so their choices come down to, like, kratom, cannabis, Suboxone, methadone, and the last two being medication-assisted treatment, where you need to go to a specialized doctor and get that from a professional medical provider or on the street. And so they're sort of teasing those sort of paths and exit ramps off of chronic opiate use in this paper.
There's a lot of poverty in Kentucky and Appalachia in general, and at one point it was pretty easy and cheap to get all these pills, but even it points out that there aren't a lot of medication-assisted treatment programs in Kentucky.
Few to no medication-assisted treatment providers in Kentucky counties. Authors considered, and I thought this was very interesting, and I just want to touch on it. We could come back to it a little bit later on the back end, but the authors of this paper seem to, and this was sort of one of my biggest, underlines and stars, consider that non-prescribed or street-sourced Suboxone use is a form of opiate misuse or abuse. So even if they're getting the same medication that they would get from a professional treatment center, if they're not getting it prescribed to them or they're buying it off the street, then that is an indicator of opiate use or abuse. And the problem, like the opiate crisis problem, would essentially get bigger if you consider this off-pad or off-prescription sourcing of these medications, making the opiate crisis worse, rather than the flip side of it would be they're getting this medication because they know that that's what they would get if they could find a doctor, if they could have a conversation with a doctor who would even, consider the prescription. You could view it as sort of the opiate crisis diminishing, I think, in that these people are just trying to get access to drugs that they would otherwise, but couldn't because of cost, availability, or just the social sort of challenges of going into a doctor these days and asking for an opiate prescription.
Medicaid-assisted treatment might not be accessible to opioid-using subpopulations equitably, and harm reduction intervention shortfalls persist. And you said there are few or no MAT providers in some Kentucky counties, and that's why they're going after diverted buprenorphine. And by the way, that's why people use kratom, because they can't access. And by the way, there's a health insurance issue, in this country that, only 33% of the sample of this have full-time employment. So I assume everybody else, unless they're incarcerated, doesn't have health insurance. So they might, still have these either opioid use disorder or addiction. And there's every indication that They even say there's a part where they talk about intravenous injection of and there's very little intravenous injection of buprenorphine or kratom, which they point to one study a case study where there was an injection of kratom, and I think I've seen that one before. I'm not sure if it's the same one in this study, but the guy just had his arm was just irritated for a week, and it was unpleasant, and it didn't work. And when I was in my interview with Dr. Grumman, he said that's kind of an indication that people aren't trying to extract the alkaloids from kratom and inject it. It's an indication that they're trying to heal from it rather than get high from it.
Right. Yeah, an exit ramp.
I think a lot of the buprenorphine trying to get strips of Suboxone on the street. The main motivation for buying illicit Suboxone is trying to treat yourself when no medical treatment is available, which would be consistent with, how poor a lot of these counties are in Kentucky.
Right. Yeah. And given that 85% were referred to this research project by the Department of Corrections, it's also, I think, really important to note, and they do, that the department, the opiate use disorder patients that are in custody of the Department of Corrections have limited opiate use disorder treatment options. They cannot use Suboxone or methadone behind bars at the time of this paper was written. I think that has changed. There was an article that I saw that basically laid out how the different states approach medically assisted treatment options for prisoners. Pennsylvania brought on a full-time MAP program coordinator in 2016. I couldn't find any sort of expansion of that for Kentucky. They say the Kentucky Department of Corrections does not permit or severely restricts the use of Suboxone and methadone, despite evidence that these drugs are potentially life-saving interventions for corrections-involved opiate users. And obviously, the Department of Corrections doesn't allow prisoners with opiate use disorder to use kratom nor cannabis, both I think which can be argued to be effective treatments for opiate use disorder while they're behind bars. So they're it's not just a your drug versus our drug type situation. They are limited in the official treatments, and they are also restricted from kratom and cannabis, and both of which, essentially, if you get caught with kratom behind bars in Kentucky, it sounds like you are going to get charged as if you had heroin on.
Yeah, yep. I was looking at that quote now. It says, it says they consider that there's an appeal because, it doesn't show up on most drug screens, although that could be different today because, the companies that make drug tests are all about releasing their latest kratom drug test, but it says although possession or suspected use of kratom can result in probation, parole, revocation, similar to heroin possession. So,
right. So you really got the deck stacked against you in this scenario.
If you're a prisoner, I wonder what the suicide rates were among people with addiction or opioid use disorder in Kentucky, since they don't have this. I know a guy that killed himself in prison. He was a heroin addict, and he got thrown in prison, I think in Maryland. And he rather than withdraw or face whatever he had to face that he needed heroin for, he killed himself. And I wonder if the suicide rates. That's all. There's probably studies on that I should have looked up, but I wonder if there's a correlation between states that don't have any kind of medicated-assisted treatment and suicide rates among people who were incarcerated for heroin possession. Or you can comment.
I was going to say another element that I looked into that I think is worth noting, and then we should probably phase in a little bit of the results here of what they found, but. This is a survey research project. The 475 or 503 people took the survey. They basically took it in a large cafeteria within their treatment center or within the Department of Corrections facility. But I was basically looking up the honesty of prisoners in taking drug use related surveys. I know for sure that just general population, the way that the questions are asked, if you say yes, then you're essentially admitting to being guilty of a federal crime. Using the drug, using a level 1 drug in the last year. And so they actually, do say, I'm trying to figure out right here. Okay, yeah. Did you use prescription opiates that were not prescribed to you? If you answer that affirmatively, you're admitting guilty to a federal drug law. And when 85% of these guys come from the Department of Corrections, it's a really significantly loaded question. I mean, they made it clear that your responses or participation in the survey wasn't going to affect your sentence or your ability and progress through the drug treatment program. But you can understand how someone who maybe got arrested for having Oxycontin or getting a prescription opiate versus a heroin opiate wouldn't want to then say, oh yeah, I also obtained heroin off the street and used that in the last year. You're admitting to a drug violation. Yeah. And so overall, I mean, it's well known that in these survey studies that people don't like to admit when they've broken the law, especially if they're already in jail. So that, there was ways that they could have asked those questions that would have been less loaded, used prescription opiates. That's it. Dropping that were not prescribed to you part, I think would have been helpful.
I mean, in this sample, there were 25% were currently incarcerated and also in the program. 85 had been incarcerated in the previous 7 years, so they might even have a bigger motive to lie about current drug use.
That presumably, even if you're out on parole, you're still committed to this treatment program. Yeah. So answering yes to that puts those people that are out now at bigger risk for potentially going back. And
really, because it's past year use, so it's recent use. So some of these people that may have been in this program, if they've been in the program for over a year and they're admitting to past year drug use, that could totally affect their parole and stuff. And that's actually not listed in the limitations. I don't think it is. Go over it again, but I don't notice that it's listed in the limitations. But that seems to be maybe one of the limitations.
Oh, for sure, definitely. Yeah. I mean, it's a limitation for broader surveys related to illegal behavior in general. I couldn't find any specific things related to prisoner honesty in drug use surveys while while incarcerated. But yeah, I mean, it definitely, luckily they have so many, they have 475 plus that they actually counted towards the statistical analysis. So there's some cushion there. But you just gotta realize that the questions could have been phrased a little bit less loaded, and perhaps allowed for a little bit more honesty there. No matter how many, no matter how clear or in written or verbally you tell somebody who's behind bars for drugs that what them, even though it's an anonymized survey too, their answers won't affect their term or their sentence there. These guys are innately skeptical of anything coming from these authority figures anyway.
And the other question I wish they would have asked was about health insurance. Do you have health insurance, and is that why you could get medicated assisted treatment, which there aren't many programs there, or is that why you could get prescription drugs? Why did you take these drugs? Was it for pain? Was it to get high?
You're right. I mean, the cost of the medical treatment, of course, is a huge factor in determining whether or not people are going to be able to proceed with it. The other element is the sort of sociological taboo factor of, given how much crackdown and tightening the restrictions have been on prescribing opiates, but then also particularly these treatment opiates. As far as I'm aware, in order to get prescribed Suboxone or methadone for opiate use disorder, you basically have to have a signed statement saying that you are admitting to or stating that you have opiate use disorder. And that can be a big hurdle for a lot of people to get over.
Definitely. There's just still that shame element attached to it, which is I don't know anything else that can cure that policy-wise other than legalizing all drugs or at least decriminalizing them, so people can just like basically come out of the drug closet and be like, yeah, I use these, and not have to worry about being incarcerated for it. And
right.
I mean,
right.
well, I mean, the whole shame thing runs deeper than that. There's, family issues and whatnot, especially if you're a parent. There's just a lot of stuff to unpack that hopefully we're progressing on. But I guess when we get to the results, so heroin was the preferred drug for the majority of Kratom users. It says, as were amphetamines, others preferred prescription opiates, non-prescribed bupe. Only 6.25% listed Kratom among their top 3 preferred substances, and within that 6.25, all ranked Kratom third. In other words, no respondent rated Kratom as his or her most preferred drug.
I thought it was interesting, too, of all of these people, I think it was only 10% of the respondents said that they had used Kratom or were familiar with Kratom. I thought that was a low number overall.
Yeah.
Only 10% reported Kratom use in the past year, which seems low to me.
I think the data was collected in 2017 too, so that might have been a factor, because I just think it's like going up exponentially in popularity. But that might be, I might have a bias there because I only started learning about Kratom in 2018. So
yeah,
I don't know. But I think that's another indication that it's preferred drug. I mean, depending on how the questioning was, it preferred for what purpose. Preferred might mean, it would ask which one makes me feel the best, and if most of these are heroin users, I'm sure, heroin feels a lot better than Kratom does. So that might have been why they answered it that way.
The question wasn't necessarily what are you using to, like, on your exit off of harder opiate use or opiate dependence. It was, which of these drugs do you prefer? So if you had a buffet in front of you, which would you prefer? And Kratom was at the bottom of the list, which I think it, is a benefit of Kratom in that it's not as intense and potent as intravenous injection of some of these opiates. I think it actually works in cannabis's or in Kratom's favor to say that it's not the most preferred drug of these past users.
And it said past year use of non-prescribed buprenorphine partially mediated the relationship between past year heroin use and Kratom reuse, explaining approximately 36% of the association between the two drugs. Sobel tests, not shown, confirm the significance of mediation. So what are Sobel tests, and what exactly does this mean? Does it mean buprenorphine was an exit ramp to Kratom from heroin? Is that essentially what that means? It's
a great question. And one of the only unanswered questions I had that I pulled out of it was what are they actually referring to in this 36% of the association between the two drugs? So maybe that's something that you can ask Kirsten next week, to just sort of break out the 36% association between the two drugs. The specific test that you mentioned, and I don't have it right in front of me, but that's just a statistical analysis in order to determine, you're looking at all of the drugs that they reported using in the past year, then you're focusing in on it and saying, okay, if you were using non-prescribed Suboxone in the past year, or if you were using heroin in the past year, how likely was that to affect whether or not you used Kratom?
Yeah.
And so yeah. I think at the end of the day, what they're saying basically is that use of heroin over the past year significantly was associated with Kratom use, but not the prescription opiates. So seemingly, Kratom is being used 2.5 times more so by those that are on a heroin exit ramp from a street source versus those who were on a prescription dependence or even non-prescribed prescription dependence. But basically it's saying people that are trying to wean themselves off or treat the withdrawal or the effects of past heroin use are going to kratom more often than those who were became dependent based on prescription use.
A lot of people I've heard from have gotten, they were on Suboxone and they just got tired of that. They just felt like it was the same sort of lifestyle as the heroin, whereas the kratom, it's like you can leave it for a couple days. I mean, this is just anecdotal, but it's I've heard that over and over again, and they'll do their Suboxone strips and stuff, but then they end up running through their quota of Suboxone, then trying to get quote unquote diverted or non-prescribed Suboxone from the street, and it's kind of the same thing. It doesn't hit you as hard as the heroin or whatever, but it's still, you're still addicted. You still want to get more. You're still finding yourself, waiting for some dealer to show up to give you some more Suboxone strips. Whereas kratom, I mean, you can buy it illegally as much as you want, for one thing, but for another thing, the addiction isn't as intense. I mean, from what I heard from people, this isn't a medically backed, whatever. You can take it or leave it much more than you even on Suboxone.
Yeah. I think, in basic language, it's essentially suggesting that people who are trying to get off heroin are using kratom, while that those are trying to move away from pills, prescription pills, do not seek out kratom as strongly. And I think you're right in all the sort of influences that you mentioned just now. But I think just how strenuous it is, and the sort of requirements and the reporting and how often you have to go to the doctor, it's not easy and it's not cheap to maintain treatment with methadone or Suboxone. Not as easy as it should be, where, I've heard that you have to go basically to the doctor every day to get your Suboxone in some cases, or you're at least going every week. You're getting drug tested the whole time. All of that stuff costs money.
Co-pays,
some people have to travel significant distances to do that. And so access to kratom seems to be an alternative that people select, particularly heroin users select when they're on that exit ramp. And there's a few questions I'll pose to you on this. Does this mean that prescription opiates are easier to quit than heroin, or does it say anything about the access to prescription opiates versus the illegal access paths or the current access to Suboxone? I think so.
I don't have firsthand experience with that, but I know now that I'm a legal medical marijuana card holder in Pennsylvania. It works for me because I don't smoke that much marijuana, but people I know that smoke tons of marijuana, there's no reason they should get a card because it's so much more expensive, and it's probably a bigger pain in the ass, whereas they just have to hang out with whatever friend they have that sells them weed once a week. It probably, it's a lot funner than driving to the other side of town for a dispensary, and it's way less expensive. And I assume that's kind of the same parallel to getting legal Suboxone versus kratom. Kratom's legal, so there's not a risk to buying and possessing it as well. And you can get as much as you want. If you need some more, you can take more. If you need less, you can take less, especially for people in Kentucky and Appalachia and rural communities. And there was another issue about that they brought up in here. People in rural communities, might have to drive an hour, 2 hours to the nearest doctor in Lexington or something to get their prescriptions. So
it's also, at this point, I think there's no official sort of policy or guidelines. So it's up to each individual doctor whether or not someone could be a medical cannabis patient and consume medical cannabis even from legal avenues, and also be on medication-assisted treatment for opiate use disorder. It's certainly a precarious place in that maybe your doctor thinks that you should not be using both at the same time, and then therefore you have to choose. I think the the wiser doctors are, sort of dealing with it on an individual basis, but it certainly is a risk if you use cannabis, even legal medical cannabis, that they might take you off the Suboxone. And so that's another sort of hurdle into maintaining that type of treatment.
Yeah. It's clear kind of the policies have to change because it's pretty complex and there's different reasons that people go into different things, and there's this whole still drug war mentality that kind of just says people are drug seeking when they might be dependent and in pain. The whole criminal aspect of it kind of screws with people getting proper care and everything, and it's just kind of a mess, and we have to have like massive policy changes, I think, to really address the issue. I mean, poverty's a big issue too. The reason people become addicted is because of trauma and living in that kind of poverty that, I mean, in West Virginia, Kentucky, and I mean, even Ohio and Pennsylvania where we are, it's traumatizing, and that's why people turn to drugs in the first place, because it just sucks being poor, and that's kind of the only thing you have to look forward to sometimes.
Yeah, and I mean, it certainly is a reaction to the fact that we in the U.S. continue to treat opiate use disorder as a sort of like failure of morality and will, and a criminal justice issue versus the medical issue that it is. Their study essentially, seems to suggest, or it looks like those that are on illicit street side of things, to detox and withdrawal and for the management of opiate use disorder, they're taking things into their own hands, using Kratom or dealer source Suboxone, non-prescribed, rather than going to a doctor and asking for the medical, the methadone or the Suboxone. I think it certainly highlights the fact that the recent spotlighting and clamping down on the prescriptions has made the conversation between doctors and patients much more difficult, is strenuous enough that it's essentially being avoided completely with people going to use Kratom over the MAT therapies. We definitely need to recast this issue as it properly is, as a medical issue rather than a criminal justice issue. And I think, some of the interesting conclusions that they lay out in the paper here, to me, are not steps in the right direction. In particular, in the conclusion, they say something, they start talking about the Kratom policy. So there's uncertain Kratom policy listed in the conclusion. And I thought it was interesting. Because the authors lay out sort of all of the stuff that we generally talk about. So whether or not Kratom's safe, its unique pharmacology, whether or not the products are adulterated, is there sensationalized or sort of drug warrior media coverage, the conflation of Kratom with other synthetic, novel compounds. The one thing that they don't particularly call out, which I think is one that we have to call out for, is that they don't mention the FDA or DEA's repeated and still uncorrected data reported that misrepresents at best and fraudulent at worst. They mention insufficient information, but that makes it seem as if there's not enough scientific data collected on the topic. Whereas I think what we have been harping on, at least in the past few episodes, has been that the FDA is either purposely or willfully ignorant of the fact that what they're reporting is not representative of what the actual data is, and that's what was behind their sort of letters of concern and their import violations. So I think the authors could have stood to include that in the mix as well here.
And they quoted concerns about prohibition, like that people would have to go back to heroin and whatnot, but they could at least say some of the FDA's arguments have been insubstantial, or just kind of what we went over with the
uncorrected, at least at the very least, that it uncorrected. They've been called out as having some issues, but they still sort of trudge forth with those issues remaining. the biggest whoa for me when I was reading this, and I think the authors did a great job with the study overall. I was glad that it was such a well-skilled team to pull this type of information together. In journal clubs, it's just sort of natural to be a little bit overcritical, but overall, I think that they found pretty valuable information. But at the end, they start saying and suggesting basically that further limiting or restricting access to kratom products will increase the opiate use disorders patients' willingness to seek professional medication-assisted treatment. So they're basically like suggesting that if we prohibit or ban or limit kratom access, then maybe the people who have opiate use disorder they'll go to the doctor versus just getting it off the street or through some other illicit manner. And that was really scary to me. The idea that a scientific team would suggest to regulators to enact more criminal justice penalties for this health issue by preventing access to what they acknowledge as a harm reduction technique, the use of kratom, could lead to people getting their treatment, the medically assisted treatment, was something that just sort of made me, really freak out. And that, like, are they really going to wrap up this paper and this study by saying, look, it seems like people who are trying to get off heroin are using kratom. They're not going to use methadone or Suboxone. We should actually make it harder to get kratom. Then maybe those people will go seek professional opiate use disorder treatment. That really scared me. I don't know if you noticed that.
No, I'm looking at that, and in my printed out article, I underlined it. Okay, in their defense, it says, after that sentence, it says, yet the high rates of non-prescribed buprenorphine use among individuals in the sample indicates that some people using heroin or prescription opioids may procure harm reduction medications illicitly, independently of formal medical channels. In other words, denied access to kratom, people with a history of illicit drug use may still procure prohibited drugs. But still, that's not exactly saying we should have kratom available to everybody who wants to use it as they see fit, which I think, it's as it is now, it's pretty safe. People are doing that, and, a lot of people aren't talking to doctors. So
Yeah, they definitely saved themselves at the end. When I saw that paragraph starting out like that, I was just like, basically like rubbing the highlighter into the paper until it started working through it. Like, oh no. But you're right. They saved themselves at the end of this paragraph, essentially acknowledging that restricting access to kratom would be restricting harm reduction options and reducing access to harm reduction treatment options is very concerning, they say. And any decrease in accessible harm reduction avenues for people with opiate use disorder is concerning. So they definitely, sort of pulled the chute at the very end there. It scares me though, because, it's always a bit of a wild card how regulators interpret and what they remember when they're reading the scientific information. And it would have been, I think, much more helpful for the conclusion to sort of discuss the fact that people are using kratom. It is a harm reduction option and avenue for people with opiate use disorder. And in fact, those who are incarcerated should have more access to be able to use kratom in these scenarios, or even medical cannabis, versus, hinting at the suggestion that if we take kratom away, maybe they'll get into the proper lane. That's just scary to me. I thought it was interesting. They mentioned specifically that the respondents in the survey were asked to report on past year of, quote, kratom use. They did not capture the variability of strain type or product brands. But more so than brand or strain, which is just essentially marketing claims, not scientific claims, they should particularly be interested in the method of administration and the dosing. So whether or not it was oral, a liquid, a capsule, a tincture, a powder.
Yeah.
How much were people using and how frequently were they using, I think is ultimately more important than the brand or strain, marketing factors, not necessarily psychopharmacology factors. Whether or not it was taken with other substances or food. But it is very nice to hear you mention that there are ongoing studies happening right now where laboratory testing is, they're allowing people to send in what they're consuming to the laboratory to actually verify whether the kratom is actually being used is kratom or it's an adulterated product, similar to kratom. So yeah, they did. I think they did a good job here of laying out those limitations. I thought it was interesting that the last note that I had on this limitation section was that they say similarly, fentanyl was not listed as a survey item, but it's likely that some respondents had consumed fentanyl in the last year. And I was just curious why. If they knew that, why would they purposefully leave fentanyl out of the equation? And it's, I think it's that fentanyl is certainly sort of like taken the forefront of everybody's attention and mind because, at first you were just breaking the law when you were buying prescriptions that were not prescribed to you off the street. But I think it's certainly the case now that, there are pretty convincing counterfeit pills that are being pressed together by these illicit actors that are, they don't even contain the reported active opiate. They contain fentanyl. And of course, you then run the risk of overdose and death there. So it's not necessarily that it costs much or that you're breaking the law. Now there's really no way to discern whether or not you're getting a real prescription or a real pill off the street unless you're getting it prescribed and picking it up at the pharmacy yourself. It's just a lot scarier now. I think that also supports people making the less risky decision of going with kratom or cannabis to treat opiate use disorder than on the street Suboxone. I did want to share the resource that we pulled together for everybody. Obviously on these biweekly journal clubs, Brian and I pick a specific publication related to kratom, generally one that has recently been published or made available. And we read those papers and then we report back to you guys on our interpretations and reflections and the findings of those papers. Now we were able to pull together a list, an ongoing reference list of all of the papers and articles that we've been reading and that continue to read for the podcast. So that's a publicly accessible reference list that anybody could get access to if you go to bit.ly, so bit.ly/Kratom Sci PDFs. So Kratom SCI PDFs, Kratom Sci PDFs, bit.ly.com or bit.ly/Kratom Sci PDFs. You'll be able to go there anytime. Just type that into a browser and you'll get a full reference list of the papers that we've either already reported on or ones that are in our queue to get to in the next couple ones.
We are grateful to the researchers for that wonderful study. Catch Jonathan Cachat at jcachat. Find links to that study and others in the description. Please like, subscribe, share, rate, review. The music is Captain Big Wheel. The song is Moon Runner. Kratom Science Journal Club is produced by me, Brian Gallagher, for KratomScience.com. Take care.